Although once at the forefront of modern computer hardware, Intel has had a rough couple of years. From Apple abandoning their chips to huge job cuts, the future of the company has never been more uncertain. But here's the thing, they sort of deserve it. Intel's higher-end 13th and 14th gen chips are everywhere at this point, unfortunately including the PC I'm writing this script on. These processors seemingly have a monumental issue which could end up costing the company billions. Basically, under certain circumstances, it's possible for the chip to receive too much power, which can permanently damage them over time. This has been leading to constant bugs, crashes, blue screens, and in some cases, permanently bricked computers. These serious instability issues were first picked up earlier this year, when a number of gamers started noticing way more crashes than anyone would normally expect. And also very early on. Remember that the 14th gen chips only came out in November 2023, so for widespread issues with chips getting identified already is definitely a worrying thought. Right off the bat, these CPUs, mainly i7s and i9s, are known for consuming a ton of power and running hot, with some reviewers showing that even with a water cooler, these CPUs can easily reach their temperature limits under heavy stress. Although this isn't necessarily an issue from time to time, if a CPU is running at max temp for a while, this can of course put way more strain on the processor and shorten its lifespan. At first, presumably in an attempt to save face, Intel released a statement basically blaming these issues on the user, but before long the number of complaints outweighed this flimsy statement, and people knew that there was something fundamentally wrong with the higher end Raptor Lake processors, especially the desktop variants. But this issue wasn't just gamers and individuals, it was starting to affect businesses too. Game developers Alderon Games published a blog post earlier this year titled "Intel is selling defective 13th and 14th gen CPUs." Throughout the post, they highlight the thousands of player crashes with the CPUs in question on their games, as well as seeing issues with memory and SSD corruptions, which they put down to CPU instability issues. This one is especially scary, back up your stuff if you've got a 13th gen chip. It's been reported that the return rate, as in people sending hardware back to Intel, has been 4 times higher than for the previous generation. These issues got so bad that in April, Nvidia had to issue a statement explaining that crashes which were being attributed to them could actually be Intel's fault. Around this time, motherboard manufacturers also began updating their BIOS to try and stop these issues from happening, but this seems to have resulted in a marked decrease in performance since the power to the chip is being throttled. This of course led to even more bad PR. To make things worse, in July, Intel refused to RMA, which is basically just an exchange, a faulty CPU of the editor of the Hardware Times. Intel say that they should have a software patch to fix the microcode bugs in August, but that still leaves us with one big question. For those of us with 13th and 14th gen chips named on the list, have our chips already potentially been irreparably damaged? Intel has seemingly been deliberately quiet when it comes to addressing the permanent damage side of things, instead focusing mainly on the instability issues. According to Tom's Hardware, they spoke to an insider who said that a degradation of the processors is irreparable, so this minor fix might stop it happening on the new CPUs, but for the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of ones out there right now, the damage may have already been done. Why these CPUs are still on the market when Intel know that they have issues is insane to me. If they don't have a patch to make the product actually work, they shouldn't be selling them, end of discussion. This is simply unacceptable, and the only way to properly remedy this situation is a recall, in my opinion. These CPUs are hardly cheap, with them all costing hundreds of dollars even on the low end. Remember that it seems to be the 65 watt and above processors, so not i5s and below. The inconvenience this has caused to countless consumers, both financially and in wasted time, is insane. I personally think that they are probably doing everything they can apart from a recall, because that truly could be the end of the company. With all of this against the higher end Raptor Lake CPUs, you probably won't be surprised to hear a number of law firms are looking into potential class action lawsuits against Intel. At this point though, months after when it all hit the fan, Intel's reputation is firmly in the bin regardless. This isn't the first time Intel's had concerns over the quality of their hardware either. A few years ago, a big story about Intel made the rounds in the tech community after someone stated that the main reason Apple no longer use Intel chips in their computers was over concerns for Intel's QA. Basically, this person alleged that they didn't think Intel were doing a good enough job at making sure their hardware actually worked properly. As much as many of you might think Apple hardware is a bit overpriced, they do tend to have a good reputation for working out of the box and ideally with minimal issues. When Apple and Intel parted ways, this dealt a very big blow to the company, and not only from losing Apple as a customer. By having their chips in Apple computers, Intel were definitely perceived for over a decade as being a reliable, solid and premium choice. This reputation started fading away around this period though, and the Raptor Lake controversy has all but cemented them as being unreliable at best in their current form. Unsurprisingly, having issues like this is going to start affecting your bottom line as a business, and it most certainly has. Earlier this morning, after showing some pretty underwhelming financial results, Intel announced that they were going to have to lay off 15% of their entire workforce. Oh, and on top of that, they've cut dividend payments. That to me sounds like a recipe for disaster, especially in the midst of such a big issue. Unsurprisingly, with no dividend and underwhelming stock performance for years, a ton of investors sold their shares off. The stock is currently down 27% today, wiping off around $26 billion from their market cap, which seems to have set a record for the worst day Intel's had in its trading history. I feel sorry for the 15,000 people being laid off, and I can't help but think a lot of this comes down to complacence on a mass scale. If Apple were having QA-related concerns years ago, that should have been the time for Intel to knuckle down and fix their shit, but instead of that being a wake-up call for them, it seems like that may have just been the beginning of the end. Let's take a look very quickly at the global chip market and see if you can guess the odd one out. Nvidia up 2,534.24% in the last 5 years, AMD up 359.86%, Taiwan Semiconductor 259%, Qualcomm up 128.36%, and Intel down 56%. What makes this even worse is that they seemingly are so narrow-minded and focused on trying to catch up to Nvidia in the AI space that they've left some huge fundamental gaps in their business, especially in the consumer space. Intel is basically trying to go to the moon, but the car which got them to the launch site is currently on fire. None of the employees individually are necessarily at fault for any of this, but the company as a whole deserves its comeuppance, especially since they tried to avoid talking much about it in their earnings report. It was just, ooh, look what we can do with AI, guys, but also we're laying off a load of people, and obviously they decided they're not going to pay dividends. Some of the other focuses, mainly around the layoffs, was things like, we're becoming more agile, we're simplifying the business, we're streamlining things, stuff like that. The other thing they also said, this is part of their money-saving measure, they're trying to scrape together about $10 billion from somewhere, so on top of laying people off, they want to cut a load of the benefits that Intel employees have. Based on a couple of posts I've seen on forums, Intel employees are paid a little bit below the market rate, but then that was actually made up with benefits. So, things like nice food and coffee, and you get your banana and, bits and bobs like that. Anyway, Intel is taking that away, and I think they're halving the sabbatical. They're halving the sabbatical pay or the sabbatical period, things like that. So a lot of the reasons that Intel employees joined the company in the first place are now being withdrawn, which definitely isn't a good sign. Based on the earnings report, it doesn't seem like they really care that much about their Raptor Lake CPUs being faulty, and if there's a class action lawsuit put through, I'm going to have to put my name down. Luckily, I personally haven't been too massively affected just yet, but I do have the dreaded out of video memory crash at least once a day. By the way, in most cases this out of video memory error is a blatant lie. It's nothing to do with the video memory, it's actually related to the CPUs being dog. So what are your thoughts on the Intel situation? Have you been affected? Let us know down below.